Hi, happy World Food Day, everybody. I'm here for another session of the People's Food Summit, and my guests in this session are Gail Fuller and Sara Keough. Sara Keough is an eco-nutritionist. She is, what are your titles, Sara?
Oh, I don't know, integrative nutritionist, functional medicine nutritionist.
But you're also like a regular licensed nutritionist as well.
Yeah,
So what are
absolutely.
your official titles?
So I have a master's degree in nutrition and integrative health, and I'm licensed as a nutritionist dietitian in Maryland.
Awesome. And Gail Fuller, he is a regenerative organic farmer. And Gail, you've had the most interesting life as a farmer. It seems that you've done the whole spectrum of farming. And I want to start there and get Sara's perspective on it too as a nutritionist. In your bio, you say that you've taken a journey from a 3,200 acre conventional corn and soybean farm to a 162 acre food farm where you've got multiple species of livestock, literally dozens of different grains, fruit, nuts, vegetable crops, all regenerative, no chemicals, no synthetics. So tell us a little bit about this journey. And Sara, I'm really curious to hear from you about your perspective on the nutrition that's produced on a 3,200 acre farm growing corn and soy versus what Gail does today.
Yeah, I mean, when we look at our whole entire food system and what's going on in the United States, I think Gail, you made an interesting comment in one of your talks before, and I've heard you say this several times, that when we look at different food deserts, food deserts in the United States, Gail has said the whole United States is basically a food desert at this point. We probably have these little gems and little hot spots of regenerative farmers like Gail, that are actually producing nutrient dense food that's chemical free. So yeah, I mean, you look at most of our food system and it's coming from, it's all commodities and commodity crops and, row crop operations like what Gail had, an industrial kind of farm with thousands of acres. And then you focus on, smaller piece of land where you're healing the soil and bringing back nutrition and raising healthier animals and livestock. So it's a refreshing experience to be on Gail's farm and to step foot on other farms like that. And they're kind of unique right now, but growing.
And Gail, what's your perspective on that? Are you producing more food now on fewer acres because you're layering so much production?
Oh, absolutely. 22 years ago when I was farming 3,200 acres, I wasn't growing any food. We were
Oh,
we were buying all of our food. For the most part, we were buying everything in the grocery store, and all I was growing was commodity corn and soy that was going into either ethanol or cattle. So I technically wasn't really growing food at the time. And I think besides what Sara talked about is the complexity and diversity now versus then is I if the world would have come to a crashing halt in the year 2000, I would have had to find a way to live off corn and soybeans the rest of my life. I'd have had a lot of them to eat. They wouldn't have had very much nutrient density in them. But today we've got chicken, lamb, duck, pork, beef, vegetables, fruit, all that's just being grown here on our farm. So and you have the saying, you are what your food eats. And so when, our cattle are not eating corn and soy, none of our animals are eating corn and soy, the beef and the lambs are completely grass finished. So, they could have, nutrients from 100 to 200 different plants in them, which each bite of meat we take. And
well,
our pork and our chicken are pastured. They're kind of free ranged, but we also supply them some organic grain along with access to pasture, so that what they're eating is much more diverse than what I used to ate. So that adds a lot of nutrition also.
so Sara, you and I met talking about regeneration in the context of climate. I remember we were at an event with some groups, including Biodiversity for a Livable Climate and Soil for Climate. and Organic Consumers Association, which I don't remember if we had started Regeneration International yet at that time. But I was very much focused on climate. I think we were at a climate event, but clearly your interest in this topic. I mean, I know that you studied in your undergraduate work, you studied ecology and environmental science, and so you have that environmental background. But that's not what does it for you now about farms like Gail. It's really about the nutrition that can come from this type of farming system. Yeah.
Well, it's all of it, really.
All of it. All of it. Yeah.
It's all of it. It was the National Academy of Sciences, some food and agriculture event 5 years ago. I'll never forget that. Richard Teague was there, and
Yeah.
David Johnson, and Rital Lau. That was a pretty unique event. Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting how everything came really full circle with my whole career journey, right? You know, I got my undergrad in biology, and it was very focused in conservation work, conservation biology. And then I kind of just felt like I had a different calling and got into nutrition. And then practicing, you know, I'm from Colorado, moved out here about 10 years ago, and practicing, when I first started practicing, it was in the DC area. And I always tell this story when I was working with, patients, foreign patients that weren't from here, weren't raised on the food in this country. They would tell me so many interesting stories, you know, about the food in their countries. But the thing that always struck me was that they'd say, why does the food have no flavor here? You know, what is wrong with the food here in this country?
Wow.
You know, and you live in the DC area too. It's a big melting pot. So I'm hearing this from people from literally all over the world, so many different places. And I thought, wow, that's really intriguing. What the heck? You know, our food has no flavor.
Yeah.
So, you know, I traveled abroad a little bit, but I guess it never struck me how different our food was here. So then that led me into this whole area of figuring out that, our soil's very, deficient, right? Our soils, our soils have really lost a lot of their microbial life, and that's a huge, huge part of this too. So I'm very focused on this whole topic, or this whole area of regenerative agriculture, because yes, we can help, create a lot of positive environmental changes by encouraging this type of farming, but we're going to bring nutrient density back into our food. But also the big thing is our microbiome. That's a huge, topic. I've given talks on that and focused on that a lot in my clinical practice, as far as how do we restore this inner ecosystem of ours to bring our microbiome back into balance. And a lot of that comes from the soil.
Yeah, I love your slogan, nourishing the inner ecosystem. And you have a beautiful website, by the way. It's econutrition.com, right?
Eco-nutrition.com.
Eco-nutrition.com. So Gail, I want to get in a little bit deeper into your journey, because it is a unique one. So, from 3,200 acres to 162 acres, was that by design? How did that happen? And what did you go through along that journey?
I guess it depends on what your definition of design is. I'm sure it was by design, just maybe not completely all of our design. The journey was difficult, extremely difficult at times. The government got involved and kind of helped guide me on my journey. Might be a way of using it. When I lost my crop insurance in 2012, that basically pushed me to the brink of bankruptcy. Also by that time, Lynette and I were on a journey of, I was, really on a journey of discovering soil health and what that meant to the health of my animals and my plants. And Lynette was on a journey of human health, and our conversations were paralleling. And we were realizing by then that the model we were currently stuck in was broken and not going to be easy to fix. And we were going to have to make a lot of changes on the farm as well as in our personal lives. So, while it's never fun going broke, and it's never fun going through the hardships that we went through especially from 2012 to 2014 during that battle, at the same time, I don't know if I would have ever been strong enough to make that leap out of the conventional industrial, large industrial mindset. I would have been what you call a regenerative farmer by then, depending on your definition of regenerative ag. But, we were still way too big and using too many chemicals and we weren't farming with the right mindset at that time. So that, it really helped us decide the downsize. We were starting to grass finish some beef. At that time, the plan was to be a large scale wholesaling grass finisher, finishing semi loads at a time, selling at scale. That's what I knew how to do. I didn't know how to tell my story. I didn't know how to direct market or any of those things because, let's be honest, I don't think the government wants us to be able to tell our story and stand up for ourselves. So, I took a couple steps in the right direction, but I was still playing the game. I went to a large conference to learn more about grass finishing, but also to look for markets. And that's where I unfortunately found out that there was a lot of fraud in the grass finish system at the time. There was grain being allowed to be fed, and it was GMO grain. And I remember going out in the hall and calling Lynette from the conference saying, we're not doing this. We're going small. If we go broke, it's our fault. I'm not playing these games anymore. And I'd also been to a couple of organic conferences at the time, thinking it would be a breath of fresh air, and come to find out there's jugs of crap at those conferences too. And it was a system designed to kill, just like the system I was in is a system designed to kill. And I didn't want to be a part of those systems anymore. Right. So we downsized. Downsizing wasn't hard. My neighbors were talking to my landowners, and, we were broke, and it wasn't that we gave a lot of ground back. We had a lot of ground taken away from us. So it was physically and mentally and spiritually, it was a really difficult time. But I tell a lot of people, if I win the lottery tonight, I'm not going back.
Wow. So raised some interesting, provocative things, in my opinion, because, we call ourselves the Organic Consumers Association, and we tell people to look for the USDA label at the grocery store. And I'm sure, Sarah, I would assume that you make similar recommendations. Yeah. So, but we have there are two kind of, I would like to think of them as steps along the way to regenerative organic agriculture, but I think they can also be kind of pitfalls for people because, I think, Gail, for you to have changed your farming practices so many times over your career is a little bit too much of a learning curve for most people. I mean, I just don't know how you did it. You basically tried everything and then ended up having a farm where you implement every single regenerative organic practice possible. So you're very unique and impressive in that way. But you spent some time moving through, I guess, what I would call a conservation agriculture phase, like the no-till phase. And then I think other farmers might get into organic, like I'm going to have a corn and soy farm, just like I always did, but it's going to be organic. And so can you speak to that a bit? Am I understanding this correctly, that these are paths towards regeneration, but sometimes people might get stuck there, or we just glorify it a little bit too much, saying like no-till is the way, keep using your chemicals, or organic is the way, you can do everything the same, just don't use certain things.
Yeah, I agree. And yeah, the journey I've been on is certainly not for the faint of heart. Like I say, it was extremely difficult. I went into a deep depression during that. But yeah, I started like most farmers start. I went from conventional till to no-till. And that was 30 plus years ago. So I was also of the mindset then, or was being told then, that no-till was the last step. It was the pinnacle of agriculture, that there was nothing else we would ever need after that. And come to find out that was a really bad statement. No-till, just like chemicals or anything else, it's a very powerful tool. When used properly, it's a very good tool. And when not used properly, it's a pretty dangerous tool. And I was not using it properly in the early going. That's when I stumbled across cover crops. And we went through some dry times in the late 90s, early 2000s, and we took the cover crops out just for financial reasons. And, the corn and soy we were growing the corn is all being removed for silage for feedlots. So we were taking all of the carbon out of the system at all. I mean, the entire corn plant was being removed, and soybeans are a very low carbon plant to begin with. So, unfortunately, I didn't have the context of knowing the value of carbon at the time. I knew nothing about living soil. I knew nothing about soil biology or microbiology. And so when we got talked into bringing wheat back into the rotation, I was going to go back to tillage because it was failing so miserably. And after 1 year of growing wheat, everything clicked because I realized what those cover crops were doing. I was planting them just to plant them. I really didn't have an understanding. But 1 year of wheat that did really well. And in eastern Kansas, wheat is not a great crop to grow because at the time anyway, we were higher moisture, higher humidity. It's not as conducive to growing wheat as western Kansas is. So to see wheat succeed like it did for the next couple of years, I realized, it wasn't about the wheat. It was about the diversity in the rotation. It was about the carbon the wheat was bringing to the soil more than anything I was doing to the wheat. And that's when I went on a really sharp learning curve about, soil and biology and carbon and water and all those things. And that's where I really started making a lot of major changes. I also had, fortunately then very soon after that, I was able to, I got asked to speak at a couple of conferences, and there you run into a couple of other rogue farmers and a couple of rogue scientists that have either been kicked out of or left the system. And you hear their stories and realize how bad the large scale model is, how corrupt it is, but also, how wonderful it can be if we can get away from that. And when you have scientists helping validate what you're doing, really helped. I think today, I look at, a lot of large scale regenerative farmers. And I think same thing can probably be said in organic is you take a step and things start to succeed. So why take a second step?
Right.
I eliminated chemicals and I started composting, and my gardens or my fields flourished, and that's all I need to do. I'm just going to keep tilling. Or, I planted cover crops and my yields went up and my chemical use dropped 10%. So why do anything else? And, I think sadly, when farmers' margins are so razor thin, that's a big part of it. They're trying to survive today. They don't have time. They can't financially afford to think about tomorrow. They can only think about today. And so that plays a huge part in why we kind of get stuck and why this change is so slow to take place. But I think, for me, if we're going to truly talk about regenerative organic, which I'm already worried about greenwashing taking effect from large industry, but I think we've got to have just a total paradigm shift in agriculture. We're miles away from regenerative organic at the moment. I mean, it's a nice thought, but we've got a long ways to go.
And Sara, how about from your perspective as a nutritionist, telling people to go find USDA organic at the store probably doesn't cut it. So
No.
I mean, we say that, but we have to do more than that. Why should we be trying to find farms like Gail's rather than just buying our USDA organic at the grocery store?
Well, for a lot of people, I kind of have to just meet them where they're at. And there's that, good, better, best, right? Like we have to move people in steps towards what's optimal. And the reality is we don't have enough regenerative farmers out there across the country to nourish everybody. We just don't.
Yes.
So, the interim step is to get people to at least go organic, support that type of agriculture. It is not perfect. That the system's being heavily criticized, as it should be, because there's a lot of, people not really playing by the rules and not really truly organic. And organic industrial farming is still destroying soil and not doing anything to regenerate it. So it's not more nutrient dense food. But my concern is that at least going organic, you are greatly reducing your toxic burden.
Right.
And I've seen this in countless studies, actually, these small kind of independent studies by various organizations, right? I use this in a lot of my presentations. We can just put people on an organic diet for 1 week and see their toxin levels drop dramatically when we do urine measurements of pesticides. So organic is a step in the right direction, from a health standpoint, to reduce your toxic burden. It's not any more nutrient dense. And let's just look at, poultry, for example. If we get organic chicken, what does that mean? What is organic chicken? And this is where I explain this to my patients in sessions. And I'm pulling up diagrams and pictures. You want to see an organic poultry operation? Let me show you what it looks like. It's a factory farm. And they're shocked because, they think this is healthy. And it's not to judge anybody's choices, right? It's to show them this is really what this label actually means, which is nothing. It just means you're getting the chicken that was fed organic, probably corn and soy. So, okay, is that a step in the right direction from conventional chicken? Yeah, but it's still not a healthy chicken that maybe never saw the light of day and is still in a factory farm given organic feed. So there's a lot of, misunderstandings and I think kind of trickery that still happens in the industry. So that's a step in the right direction, but sourcing is difficult. And that's where Gail's spot on, that we are in a giant food desert because, my whole message really to people is to go local as much as possible, right? And seasonal, try to really eat seasonally. So then that would mean not buying a lot of bananas and avocados that don't really grow here. And I do try to practice what I preach. I've cut down on a lot of those foods, and even coffee, I don't drink as much anymore. Coffee's not native to this area, So if we're really going like hyper local, and if we're trying to source from farmers that are nearby, it's difficult, So I've done as much homework as I can, to support my Maryland clients, and myself, and finding farmers that are nearby here. But, thank God you guys have the Regeneration International map. And I always direct people to that, right? Because I have patients across the country too, that, okay, here, plug in your zip code, and I want you to try to find, at least a couple farms nearby. And if that's not an option, there are places that do ship. And I don't love that option of getting your food shipped across the country from a regenerative farmer. But if that's what you have to do to get nutrient-dense food, so be it. But first, try to find what's as local as possible, and just kind of stop going to the grocery store.
Yeah.
I don't care if it's Whole Foods, I don't really care. Whole Foods doesn't mean anything to me. They have so much junk in that store. It's unreal. So, local health food stores, I try to support them because they're more likely to source more local stuff. But that's my whole message to a lot of consumers and to my patients, is to just really, really stop trusting labels and get to know your farmer, because that is the only way we're going to change our food system. And I could talk on and on about, Liz Reitzig and her awesome buying club. And there's many like that. 1,000 Eco Farms, I think is the website, right?
Yep.
People just Google that 1,000 Eco Farms. You will find some of these regional and local buying clubs in your area. And, what Liz does is she and her family, right, they kind of run this buying club. They go around to all the different farms throughout Maryland and Pennsylvania and Virginia, pick up your order. You basically order everything online from the local farms, and then you just go to a drop point and pick it up. You don't even have to go to a grocery store, and you're buying things from a local farmer. So there's awesome systems in place to help with sourcing, but it's a matter of getting people connected to those things and growing that and getting more regional food systems going.
Yeah, definitely. So I do want to go back to what you said initially about the huge benefit of eating organic, even if it's just grocery store USDA organic, is to get the pesticides out of your system. And Gail, you talked about, you were having reality-based depression when you were, losing your farm and everything was going wrong. I mean, that's a good reason to get upset. But I also have seen information. I just Googled it, and right away, Scientific American, a big headline that says one of the reasons why farmers have higher rates of suicide and depression is because of the farm chemicals that they're exposed to. I've heard you talk about this as well. So let's get into that topic for a bit.
Yeah, that was obviously a big part of why we wanted to get away from the chemicals. And this is really before I, realized how bad my mental health was. And just for clarification, I've never been diagnosed with depression or any of those things. Probably doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out, my mental state has had some weaknesses in the last few years because of this. But there's plenty of scientific documentation now, independent research that shows direct links between pesticides and not just gut health, but mental health, and gut health and mental health are tied together. So, and I think when you and Sara were talking about buying organic is certainly one step in the right direction, albeit not, not a huge step, but we're getting away from the pesticides and the toxins, but also, the workers on those farms that are harvesting and not being exposed. That's a big point for us is, we're trying to, we want to do right by every step of the supply chain that we can. And so, if just knowing that the people working on those farms and, the immigrant labor, the pickers, all of those aren't being exposed to heavy doses of pesticides like they are on the conventional produce and vegetable farms and chicken houses and things like that. That's a big thing for us because I don't like the mental and physical issues I've dealt with, and I certainly don't want to wish that on somebody else that's working their butt off to put food on my table. I don't want to be responsible for it.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah, we have a social justice reason to quit the pesticides as consumers or as farmers, for sure. So Sara, tell us a little bit more about your concept of nourishing the inner ecosystem and how pesticides are part of what disrupts that inner ecosystem.
Well, yeah, I mean, we know now that glyphosate's a patented antibiotic, which was a big wake-up call that Gail always talks about. It was a big wake-up call for me too. I mean, I always knew, these chemicals in our food aren't good, but wow, that was like a big realization. It's a patented antibiotic. So we know that these chemicals, are destroying a lot of our microbiome. And it's very interesting to look at some of the research that's been done on, various microbiomes of people throughout the world, when we can do some stool testing and look at all the different species in the gut. And one thing I often talk about is diversity. And Gail had mentioned it too. This is important in regenerative operations to really maximize diversity of all your different species of plants and to get all those, microbes back in the soil as well. So we also want a lot of diversity in our microbiome, And, we are a walking ecosystem, right? Like we have an ecosystem on our skin. We have microbes on our skin throughout different organ systems, respiratory, oral microbiome. It's not just the gut microbiome, but that is where most of our quantity wise, where most of our microbes is in the colon, our big fermentation factory. So a lot of these chemicals are absolutely, I think probably the biggest reason we're missing a lot of beneficial species and our diversity has completely tanked. So back to what I was saying before, all the different studies of microbiomes of various people throughout the world. I always talk about this in my presentation and show diagrams on this. There's the Hadza people in Tanzania, which have, they've looked at some of their stool samples and they have incredible amount of diversity in their gut. We look at their health and they don't exhibit all of the modern health issues that, that we have, right? In westernized countries, I guess you could say the rates of heart disease and cancer and diabetes and all that, right? And digestive issues. And they're typically normal weight. They don't have obesity problems, right? So we've been able to make these very, very strong correlations between increased diversity and lower rates of these chronic diseases. And, then we compare their microbiomes to ours and it's very sad. It's a very, very sad picture. We can, you can literally see on these diagrams that they create all the different blank spots we have. And then when you're missing all those beneficial species, to kind of use a ecological term, you open up this ecological niche for a pathogen to kind of take over the microbiome. And that could be yeast and mold and parasites. And, I don't think all those things are inherently bad. They're part of an healthy ecosystem. But when they start to take over your ecosystem, that's when they can create some diseases and, absolutely connected to mental health and cognitive issues as well, big time. So, there's this actually very interesting research around parasites that they tend to be a little more active around the full moon. Our melatonin levels drop around the full moon. And this is why people go a little crazy sometimes around the full moon, they say, because some parasites will flare up and cause issues. And it turns out some of my patients, I've seen this correlate. that they're issues that we've been able to kind of trace back to a parasitic infection in the gut.
Wow.
Their issues get worse around the full moon. So just an interesting little aside about, the gut brain connection and that ecosystem as it relates to mental health and wellness. So,
Wow.
yeah. So, I mean, we have these, parasites and bad things that take over, and are they really bad, or is it just that we're missing a lot of that diversity? And that it's such an interesting comparison as to what's happening in conventional agriculture too. Why do weeds take over? What's a weed? What's a weed, Gail? Like, why is that taking over? Why is it a bad thing? It's serving a purpose in that ecosystem, but again, we're missing a lot of those beneficial plants that help balance out that ecosystem, and the chemicals absolutely destroy that. The overuse of antibiotics is a big deal too. Agriculture actually uses 4 times more antibiotics than in human medicine.
Mm.
So when you're eating animals that have been given antibiotics, you're essentially taking in antibiotics. You're really adding to the destruction of your microbiome, even if you don't actually take antibiotics. So that's why, again, sourcing is very important as far as animals that haven't been given antibiotics in as part of the conventional system. So yeah, it goes back to a lot of these chemicals, I think, that are destroying our microbiome, our ecosystem.
Yeah. So, Gail, back to your story of making this really intense transition from totally conventional agriculture to very deep regenerative, organic, full scale, all the practices. Could you have done this without animals?
It would have been very difficult. I think animals are, I know farmers that are doing it without animals. It's a slower process. Animals really speed it up. They bring, the diversity above ground. They bring the diversity in the way they graze. They bring diversity to the microbiome. I mean, they just bring so much to it. And, for us, it's about trying to farm and live in nature's image. And I'm in Kansas. And if you want to look at history, that we've got some of the deepest, richest soils on the planet here, and they were formed by grasslands being managed by large herds of animals. So that's why, I think animals are extremely important in any system. We try to, we obviously don't have access to bison here. I wouldn't mind having bison, but we bring in cows and we try to, use them as a replacement for the bison. But we also realized that it wasn't just the bison managing the plains. There was deer and antelope and bear and wolf and birds and insects by the gazillions. And so it's a matter of promoting it all. So just bringing cows back onto the farm, it's kind of like going to organic or going to no-till. It's a nice first step. But, to complete the system, we need diversity. And for us, that's why we have, actually we have 6 or 7 species of livestock running around here. And for us, we're trying to promote wildlife as much as possible, because I don't think you can have a truly healthy system if you don't have abundant, healthy wildlife.
Yeah. Yeah. So, Sara, how about in terms of nutrition? I know you don't have anything against vegans or vegetarians. I was a vegetarian for 30 years, and I've really found it very fun to eat with you. You've expanded my palate quite a bit. I was like, wow, chopped liver is actually delicious. And, I really love hearing your stories, just personally about the school that you went to for nutrition, and how like preparing traditional animal foods was such a big part of that. You're not pushing this on anybody, but yeah, what are the nutritional benefits of this type of regenerative agriculture where animals are doing have a big place?
Oh my God, that's such a big topic, and I could talk for hours about it. So yeah, I mean, look, I was vegetarian once upon a time too. I even tried veganism, and I have vegan clients, that come to my practice, and they know the diet's not working for them anymore, and they wanted expand their diet and introduce animal foods. So I in school, so in my master's program, we took, these whole food cooking classes. And one of my favorites that I really fell in love with liver was an organ meat cooking class. And we also learned various ways of making bone broth. And that gave me a really just profound appreciation for animal foods and using some of the most nutrient dense parts of the animal, not just sitting down and eating a steak. It's like you're really learning how to extract all the nutrients from bones and the collagen and how wonderfully healing that is for the gut and just the whole body. But, organ meats are one of the most nutrient dense foods on this planet, period. I mean, vitamin A, zinc, copper, B vitamins galore, choline. There's just so many nutrients. Does liver have it all? No. That's why we need a diversity in our diet. So, and other nutrient dense foods, fruits and vegetables, of course, but liver is very underappreciated still. And, Gail knows I'm always teasing him at field school, like, is there going to be some liver on the menu again or some other organ meat? And he's done a great job incorporating that. So that's, liver's not the most palatable thing, of course, so there's lovely ways to prepare it, to make it really tasty. So that's part of what I love teaching patients, is how to incorporate it into their diet in a way that's, going to be feasible for them and the whole family to eat. The other thing I can say about nutrient density, though, is, I always talk about the work of Dr. Stefan Van Vliet. He is now he was at Duke. He's in Utah, and he's doing some fascinating research along with Dr. Fred Provenza. So Stefan actually just did a really great webinar with Green Cover Seed, and it is on YouTube. And he presents some of this research that he's in the process of getting published, where he has actually looked at the nutrient density of pasture-raised animals versus conventionally raised animals. And, there's been a lot of attention on the omega-3 and 6 differences between these two types of livestock, but now he is finding all sorts of amazing things as far as phytonutrients. Phyto means plant. So when I first heard him and Dr. Provenza talking about phytonutrients in animal proteins and fats, I thought, what are they talking about? Those are plant compounds. But if you have an animal eating this beautifully diverse diet, right, full of all these different phytonutrients, they are in turn incorporating that into their tissues. So we're actually getting all these, secondary compounds, from the plants through the animal. So by eating the meat and the fat, that's where we get all those phytonutrients. And so he's doing all this research, looking at all these metabolites and seeing what's actually in the meat, the grass-fed meat, the truly grass-fed meat, right? 100% pastured meat on regenerative operations. And we can see some very, very big differences. And even looking at inflammation levels in the animals. Really interesting. He was measuring markers when he sent me some of his, preliminary stuff. I thought, wow, you're measuring things that I measure in my clients, because I order a lot of testing in my practice, and I'm looking at, what is going on with someone's physiology. And when you look at inflammation markers, that tells you a lot about what's happening, for them. And we want to control that inflammation, bring that inflammation down. And the fact that they're looking at inflammation in animals, that's really fascinating. So animals eating an unhealthy diet, no surprise, they're more inflamed, than an animal eating this phytonutrient rich diet. And then, getting into the microbiome of the animals, a whole other topic. I'm sure we're going to see a lot of differences in the microbiomes between those two animals. So that's all the fascinating stuff that's going on right now. Like Dr. Van Vliet I tell him all the time, he's just going to be one of the heroes of this movement, because he's giving us the solid evidence we need to be able to make the health claims that this is actually more nutritious. But we already have a lot of great evidence, and they've published some of their research already.
I just want to add on to that, because we talked about social justice with the workers, especially on organic farms, and that how important that needs to be for everybody. But there's, Sarah's spot on in her last answer, and we organ meat and is highly nutritious, more so than the regular mussels. But it's also, we owe this to the animal. I mean, we owe the animals a good life, which is why they shouldn't be raised in a barn, organically or not. They're animals. They should be able to live a life. And then we owe it to them to respect them in passing. If they're going to give their life for us for nutrition, we need to use it all.
Yeah, that, and as Sara was talking about that, it reminded me that another huge issue for farmers raising animals is how to get them processed. And sometimes I was reading, so I interviewed Ridge Shin and Lynn Pledger. They have a new book out. It's called Grass-Fed Beef for a Post-Pandemic World. A lot of their book is about getting your animals processed because, if you're going to switch, all of a sudden you were growing corn and soy. Now you have a diverse operation with lots of different animals. Getting your animals processed is a big deal. And one of the points that Ridge made was that he really wants to see, he's in the Northeast, he really wants to see some integrated processing operations so that farmers can get their animals processed at a scale that enables the processors to be able to find the market for each bit of the animal. He was saying that was something that the big mega factory farm industrial processors, like they want to make money off of every single thing that comes off of that animal. And so they found all of these markets, but it's a little bit more difficult for farmers to do that when they're processing locally. Have you had that issue, or is it more like what you were suggesting is it's the consumer who needs to be ready to try new things? I think I saw on your website a beautiful plate of fried chicken hearts. Yeah, did I remember that correctly? Yeah. So it's like we need to learn, like Sara has learned, and like she teaches her patients like how to, or clients, we need to learn how to cook again and make use of all these parts of the animal. So am I off base? Is this about processing, or is this about the consumer?
No, I think my opinion is it's about the consumer. I'm able to bring home, I can actually bring home more organ meat from the processor than most large scale producers. Sadly, the pork industry is probably the absolute worst and gets no attention at all. I mean, people are focused on chicken and beef, and that's fine. But pigs, I guess I don't know if I should say this because I don't know if I've looked personally, but I'm told that you can't find pork liver in a grocery store. And that's because the pork livers aren't salvageable by the time they process a fat pig coming out of a confinement operation. We sell pork liver. We're able to get most of the organ meat out of all of our animals. It's just a matter of getting consumers to understand they need to include that in their diet. Stress causes issues with organ meat. The way cattle are fed, the way chickens are fed. Obviously the way pigs are fed, that's high stress, and that leads to lower quality in the organ meat. And, I think especially I'm partial to pigs because it would be like putting us in confinement. It'd be like the concentration camps. I mean, pigs are extremely social, extremely intelligent, extremely curious. And we lock them into a facility, and pigs get a bad rap for being a dirty animal. They're not a dirty animal. They're the cleanest animal on the farm. They're the only animal on the farm that won't eat, sleep, and poop in the same place if given a choice. And we put them in a barn and force them to eat and sleep in their poop, which, mentally, what does that do to the animal? And if an animal is not only stressed but depressed, that's not meat I'm interested in consuming because it can't be nutritious.
So are you able to get your pigs processed and have pate made for you at your local processor? Like who's doing your processing, and how do they give it back to you or prepare it for your customers?
We have two small mom and pop processors that one does our large animals, hoofed animals, lamb, sheep, pork, and the other one does the birds. We are able to get back almost all of our organ meat. We can't get back the brain. I wish we could, but we can't. But we get kidney, heart, liver, tongue, all those things. No, they won't process it into pate or things like that. We have to do that ourselves. So again, it goes back to the consumer, learning how to how to cook some of these things. And it's really no more difficult to make pate than it is to make, you know, make eggs Benedict or anything else. So it's not that hard, and it's actually really, really good. So.
Yes, it is. I can attest to that part. Well, let's talk a bit about the Fuller Field School. So, Gail, when did you start the Fuller Field School, and what is it?
We started it in 2012. I had been speaking for a few years by this time, and I really enjoyed public speaking and meeting farmers and sharing my story, and and helping them make change. And so we were doing some work with Dr. Jill Clapperton, who's a renowned rhizophere ecologist. She's a fantastic scientist, and she and I were working on some projects with intercropping in our corn and wheat and soybeans at the time. And we were standing out in a field one day, and she goes, "Do you want to do a workshop?" And I said, "Heck yeah, I want to do a workshop." And so, we kind of hatched the idea at supper that night with Lynette and Jill, and we put together Fuller Field School, and Jill helped co-found it. And there was a couple things. She helped run it the first year. After that, we took it over, and we've run it ever since. But Jill was really adamant in year one. Two things were going to happen. Number one, we weren't going to just throw out donuts and barbecue from whoever had the cheapest food in town. We were going to source food locally. We were going to call it a school instead of a workshop or a conference, because we wanted to get really deep and in depth, and we wanted the people to understand they were coming here to work and learn. I mean, it was going to be, at depth. But one other thing happened in that first year that sadly was mind-blowing for me, and it really put my life and my career in perspective. I was 49 years old at the time, and Jill did a session on food and nutrition. And it was the first time in my life I had heard this discussed at an agriculture conference. Pretty sick for a farmer to be 49 years old before they ever hear food mentioned at an ag conference. And that changed the focus. It changed the direction of the school. And from there, we that first year was basically a cover crop conference, but after that, it became a school that focused on the carbon, water, mineral cycles, energy flow, human, animal, and soil health, and the parallels in between. And this year, in the last couple of years, we've even taken it further, and, going into mental health, going into community health, not just the community of birds and insects and things like that, but human communities. And we've got to regenerate them as we go. And there's just been some real changes in my life and Lynette and I's lives, and how we live and how we farm and how we manage. It's come out of, the great people we've met, like Sara and Jill, along the way, that have helped gently nudge us in a different direction.
Yeah, so that's how you two met, right? So Sara was invited to speak. Is that how you all started working together?
We met a little bit before.
Yeah. No, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, we when you first reached out to me, I think it was just on Facebook. We would talk for hours. You remember that? Just messaging back and forth. And then he asked me if I wanted to come out, and I didn't even know what I didn't know much about field school, sadly, at the time, and I didn't know what was coming out for. Okay, Savory, Kansas. All right, sure.
So, Gail, why were you looking for a nutritionist to talk at your field school?
Food had become a real issue. I mean, Jill talked about it in the very first one, and the ties of healthy soil and healthy food. And so it's something we had been studying. Sara wasn't by far the first. We'd had, Fred Provenza had talked about animal nutrition, and, what's the difference between animal? We are animals. So animal nutrition is human nutrition. And Dr. Don Huber was a speaker one year talking about all the dangers with glyphosate and the toxins, but he tied that to human health. And Walter Yana, the climatologist from Australia, talked about human health and how there's correlations. And then we had Zach Bush in 2019 with Fred Provenza. It was a real aha year to have those two together, and an entire school focused just on health. And so Sara was just a great next step. We'd done a lot of work on health, but we'd really never had a nutritionist. So she was able to bring things that all of those other speakers hadn't brought before, and it just took us to a different level. And it was kind of awesome. As a speaker, you get done after 45 minutes or an hour, hour and a half, whatever it is, and that mob that comes rushing to the front, all those questions, and you stand in line for 30 minutes and miss lunch or whatever. And we have a really, really diverse crowd at the field school. We're really blessed. We have urban, rural farmers of all scales and practices, and GM, non-government NGOs and government agencies. But after Sara spoke, the line of people wanting to ask her questions was all the old white guys in cowboy hats. I was shocked. It wasn't the females like I expected. It wasn't the urban people or the consumers. It was the cowboys, and I was really blown away by that. So you don't think those are the people that are concerned about health, but they were there asking questions. So that was really a big moment for me anyway.
So Sara, I know that is your very favorite place to be, is on a farm, talking about nutrition with people who really know how to build nutrition through their farming practices. But tell me about your enjoyment of the field school. I've heard it personally, but tell our audience.
Yeah, and I'm taking you with me next year.
Yeah,
it was probably my most favorite talk that I gave thus far, and I've spoken at I don't know how many ag related events over the last couple years, throughout several spots in the country. So that was definitely my most favorite experience, and it was just the people there that made it such a great experience. It's a fantastic community, and they're very open. I've found not that same openness in other settings. And I think, Gail has this gift of just bringing people together and making them feel like they're in a place where they can share. And even though, we could talk about what we wanted to do at the mental health workshop last year, and we didn't get a chance to add on a third day, field days, usually 2 days, we had wanted to do a third day on mental health. And even though we didn't really get a chance to dive into those topics, and most of my talk was centered around, the gut microbiome and going into that, and digestive health, and very important kind of foundational topic. But despite that we didn't go into the mental health issues as deeply, people were still bringing it up and talking about it and opening up. And that was probably one of the most beautiful aspects of it all, really, was just seeing the openness and people just really wanting to share. And so I almost wasn't going to make it out for this one as an attendee, this year. And I don't know, what was it, Gail, like a couple of weeks before, I just woke up one day and I said, I have to be there. I have to go. How can I not go? The people are just so awesome. And I got to, just deepen all those connections with everybody, that I met last year, and get to know everybody and hear more of their stories. And it was a beautiful field school. We had Charles Eisenstein there, and he certainly dived deep into, community, and just, he's very philosophical type of speaker, and very emotional, so it was nice to just see everyone kind of letting themselves be vulnerable and share. And yeah, so we have some other projects in mind now as a result of that.
Yeah. What's next, Gail? So you do this every year in September?
We do it every year. It has bounced around in multiple months. We really wanted to have it in every month because there's always something different to look at outside, January, July, whatever. So that way you're not looking at the same species of insect or bird every year, not the same flowers blooming or whatever. So, but COVID kind of, we had to deal with 3 years of restrictions and things like that. And we actually hosted live events in 2019, 2020, 2021, 2022, but because of, our desire to host the events and keep it live, we wanted to move it outside. And so September, early October in Kansas is probably the best bet for warm, dry weather where you're not at risk to deal with the wrath of Mother Nature. So that's the last 3 years have been in September. Because we now don't want to go back indoors, it may stay in September because, again, that's kind of a safe time in Kansas to be hosting outdoor events. So we'll see. We haven't got next year's completely planned yet. There's been some interest in 2 events, but nothing to share yet.
Well, I've noticed on your website that you have, you can visit the farm. You have camping options. You have an Airbnb on the farm. So, and I've seen a lot of videos of your farm, and I've seen your animals out grazing through the snow, getting into the garden, and grass and stuff that you've left there so that animals can graze in the winter. So it seems like it would be a great place to visit. You could learn something any time of year.
Yep, absolutely. We're blessed to have an Airbnb on farm right in the thick of it, and we also have Hip Camp and Harvest Host, which is tent camping and RV camping options, and we offer farm tours. So there's lots of ways to come see it, and we do some on-farm dinners from time to time, which are fantastic events. We bring in chefs from Kansas City or Wichita, and they just kind of take us around the world to different cultures and just all kinds of fantastic food. For us, it's at the end of the day, it all boils down to food. Food is the great connector, and we have to make food an event again.
So what's next for you two?
Well, I'm going to talk about it, Gail.
Go ahead, fire.
Yeah, so, I talked about how last year we wanted to do that third day on mental health and wellness. And so that's what we're planning on doing now moving forward, hopefully for this winter. So we're just in the process of planning everything right now, but we'd love to do, our dream project is to really do 4, different workshops over, maybe once a month, planning out these 4 different workshops and hopefully 4 different areas throughout Kansas, just starting with Kansas, and really just helping to give farmers tools to be more resilient against all the immense ecological, or I should say environmental and economical stressors, right? There's so many stressors that they're facing right now. And we talked about at the beginning, there's the suicide rates are higher amongst the farming community. Farmers almost twice as likely to commit suicide than someone in the general population, which is a really startling statistic that I just found out about. So, hearing stories of farmers I've, met with all throughout my travels, I've traveled all over the country doing farm tours. And the most important thing to me isn't just seeing the farm and being there. That's one wonderful, beautiful aspect of it. But I want to hear the farmer's story and hear where they've been, where they're going, what they, what they're struggling with currently. And it's, it's a serious issue that we truly need to focus on. And, Gail can speak to the, lack of, resources that are out there for farmers that are struggling with mental health issues, whether it's depression and anxiety or, suicide or, eating disorders. I think those are all things that the farming, community, just like other communities throughout the country, are struggling with. The pandemic has really, created a lot more problems for people in that respect too. So, yeah, so we're trying to create something that probably hasn't been created before, and hopefully, launch this in other states if it's successful in Kansas, and particularly in rural communities.
Yeah, thank you for that, Sara. But yeah, I think we're, regenerative ag, whether it's regenerative organic or whatever you want to talk about, is the hot topic, and everybody wants to talk about soil health and cover crops and earthworms and nutrient density. But we're really looking at this piecemeal, and until we regenerate the farmer, we can never fix the farm. So we have to start with ourselves, and farmer health is sadly terrible, mentally, physically, spiritually. And so until we start to address this, we really can't do much as far as healing the farm, healing the landscape, healing the environment. So that's why we're doing what we're doing. That's where we're going.
Such an important message. Well, thank you, Gail Fuller, Sara Keough. This has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for taking us on this journey. Hope to talk with you both soon.
Thank you, Alexis.
Thank you.
Hello, welcome. Hi, I'm Alexis Badenmare. I'm the political director of the Organic Consumers Association. We're the U.S. representatives of Regeneration International, and this is part of our World Food Day broadcast, part of the People's Food Summit. So happy World Food Day, everybody, and welcome to Dr. Sacoby Wilson. So, Dr. Wilson, I know about your work through the Socially Responsible Agriculture Project, and that is a fantastic organization of citizen scientists and local activists who are fighting factory farm pollution in their hometowns. And so you're a scientist at the University of Maryland. I'm going to read a little bit of your bio because you are a very busy person. I don't think all of the work that you do will come out in this conversation. So I want people to know about your broader work. So Dr. Wilson, you're a professor at the University of Maryland. You're in the Applied Environmental Health Department, and also the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics in the School of Public Health. But you're the director of the Center for Community Engagement, Environmental Justice, and Health. And then in addition to the many hats that you wear at the University of Maryland, you also have worked with communities around the country on environmental justice issues. And you've even started organizations of your own, or, with these communities. But you have, so you're also, I'm trying to scroll through your very long bio to find the section on the organizations that you have helped start. Okay, so here it is. You're the co-founder of the Mid-Atlantic Justice Coalition, as well as the DMV. And for those outside of our area, that's the District of Columbia, Maryland, and Virginia Environmental Justice Coalition. And you're the founder of 17 for Peace and Justice, an environmental justice advocacy organization. And there's also a bunch of student groups that you're involved in. You've won tons of awards. So I just can't believe, and you do a lot of work on panels and task forces with the local government, the state government, the national government. So you are very busy. I am very surprised that I was able to get a hold of you and that you were willing and able to give an hour of your time to this conversation.
It's a whole hour, right? Okay. Yeah, it's a lot of time for me.
Okay, good. If you've got an hour, I won't.
No, we can. We're fine. No. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Yeah, I do a lot of stuff, but doing this work is really important. It's part of my mission. It's part of my why. And my center, which we pronounce Siege, we're about doing science that serves communities and making sure that science that's done is of the community, for the community, and by the community. And we talk about doing science that's empowerment science. How can you use science to empower people, not with an E empower, but with an I empower, helping people connect to the power that they already have through science. You don't have to have a PhD. This is everybody out there. You don't have to have a PhD to be a scientist. You just got to use the scientific method. And we can use science that moves people to action solutions that's applied. That's powerful, right? And we do liberation science. We want to liberate folks from toxicants, from sacrifice zones, from being poisoned every day, right? Whether it be industrial animal operations in the Eastern Shore of Maryland, or CAFOs, industrial hog farms in North Carolina, or cattle feedlots in the U.S., or cattle feedlots in the Southwest in Mexico, right? Or other parts of the world. If it's incinerators, power plants, these facilities, for some reason, tend to be in places where people have been invisibilized, that they don't have power, that their voices are not being heard. So we try to bring science to the people, do science of the people, have science by the people. So this science is actually moved from extraction to action, right? A lot of science about what's wrong with you. We want to have more science about what's right with you. We want to have more science that's about the root causes and not just get into genetics. Genetics is great, but guess what? What we know, what we need to do, everyone? Clean the air, clean the water, give people access to safe food. That's part of this discussion, right? Safe housing. We have a human right to clean air. We have a human right to clean water. We have a human right to safe housing. We have a human right to safe food. And that's what we try to push for as a center.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, so the other thing that I learned, I started looking at some of your more recent talks because it's been a little while since I saw you in person. And then I found the Siege's Medium blog. And there are two articles here that I think are really important. I came to look it up because you were talking about, in one of your talks recently, you were talking about how factory farms in North Carolina and where people were enslaved in the state, you can put a map there and it basically matches up. And then it just made me look at segregation in a whole new light. I mean, not that I wasn't familiar with topics related to environmental racism, but it's extremely stark when you see that image of North Carolina and the map perfectly matches slavery, and now it was up to date as of 2014, the hog farms, the factory farms that had been re-permitted there. So let's get into that concept of environmental slavery in the context of factory farms and the food system. So what is environmental slavery, and how is this impacting the food system and the way food is produced in this country?
Yeah, it's a concept that grew out of my work in North Carolina. I went to grad school in UNC Chapel Hill. I was mentored by Dr. Steve Wing, who was he's no longer with us. He passed away several years ago, but he was the one who really got me into doing work on environmental justice and factory farms, particularly the issue of industrial, hog farms in North Carolina. And it was interesting, and I forget which year. It could have been 2015. He came to me and was like, Sacoby, I have this really cool map I want to show you. I was, okay, Steve. I think it was either in person or on a phone call. And we talked about it. I said, man, that's a powerful map. So Steve created that map. I said, that's a powerful map. You can look at it. Enslaved population, I believe it was in 1860. It was it's enslaved population in North Carolina, 1860s. And you see like the concentration of enslaved peoples, primarily, in Eastern North Carolina, right? And then you fast forward to present day, the 2,500 plus industrial hog farms in North Carolina, and you overlay the map, and you see those farms are located in where those folks, those descendants of enslaved Africans live in North Carolina. So part of the concept of environmental slavery came from the fact that you have these communities that are used to host environmental disamenities, right? They are used to host these hazards and locally wanted land uses. They internalize the externalities, the social externalities, right? The negative economic externalities, how property values go down, right? They get trapped in those homes, they get trapped in those neighborhoods. They internalize the environmental externalities, the pollution from these factory farms, whether it be air quality impacts from ammonia, hydrogen sulfide, volatile organic compounds, right? They can cause asthma and cause mood disorders, they impact your immune system, whether it be water quality impacts from the nitrates, and also bacteria that can impact well water, because many of the folks that live in these operations are on well water. So if you have a lagoon spill, right, that water that fecal material can get into your well water. If they're spraying waste on the spray field, you can have drift from that spray field and get in people's homes. They can get into their gardens, right? Get inside their homes. And so you have these impacts, again, air quality, water quality, microbial impacts. And then, there's the people get stuck, they get trapped. And these impacts are intergenerational. And I thought, because of the work that I do with communities in the environmental injustice movement, we talk a lot about environmental racism, right? How some communities are targeted for these hazards because of their race. Dr. Bullitt, who's known as the father of the environmental justice movement, calls it, he says, complexion for protection, or, he says money follows power, money follows whites, right? And so you have white privilege that plays a major role in who gets the hazards and who is left out, right? He talks about how money is very important about the haves and have-nots, and so the avenue of least resistance, the less economic power you have, the less political power you have. But if you think about it in North Carolina with the industrial hog farms, and even the history of the environmental justice movement, I would be remiss if not talking about the history. The EJ movement started in North Carolina 40 years ago, September. We just had a signing with the EP administrator of this new Office of Environmental Justice and Civil Rights in Warren County, North Carolina, where the EJ movement started. where folks in 1982 fought against a landfill that was containing PCB contaminated dirt, so polychlorinated biphenyls. For some reason, if this landfill found its way to a poor Black community in North Carolina, who again had limited economic power and limited political power. So the term environmental racism was coined by Dr. Benjamin Chavis, Reverend Dr. Benjamin Chavis, during that fight in Warren County. We also have the term environmental classism. You get targeted because of your income, right? Your economic status. But I thought those terms weren't strong enough because some communities end up being used to host these hazards for decades upon decades upon decades. So it's environmental slavery. It's environmental servitude. It's environmental apartheid. I'm from Mississippi. Look at what's happened in Jackson, Mississippi, right? Similar to what happened in Flint, Michigan, right? That's an example of environmental apartheid. Y'all know apartheid. We talk about racism in this country and what happened in South Africa, apartheid. We got apartheid-like systems in the U.S., apartheid-like system in the U.S. South, where the government controls the political landscape and political processes. And we, even when there's money to address the problem, if it's to address the issues of the poor, y'all know what I'm talking about. I'm not going to call out any certain celebrities, any athletes in Mississippi. Y'all know what I'm talking about. To address the poor, issues of the poor, or to address water quality, water infrastructure issues in Jackson, Mississippi, which is predominantly Black. Think about all the capital cities for those of you who are in the U.S., capital cities in the U.S., it's 80% Black. What other capital city in the U.S. has 8% Black people?
Well, not anymore, but Washington, D.C. used to have a majority Black population.
Yeah, used to have majority Black, but that capital city, 8% Black, right? So you have a government, the governor, right, that's controlling resources that are available to address the problem and hasn't released those resources. That's environmental apartheid. So for me, you see that happening in North Carolina. You see it happen in other parts of the country, this environmental slavery. And so, you know, these communities are getting more of the harms, but get none of the benefits. So basically, you look at the body of the community being used, right, to absorb those toxicants, those externalities.
Yeah, I found that was the hardest line in your article to hear, but it was also probably the most truthful. Is that it's essentially, when we think of the waste being centered there, the pollution, it's not just like the place is absorbing all of these things, it's the bodies. I was kind of floored to read it because it's very hard hitting. It's hard to come to grips with that, but that's exactly it. It is the siting of this pollution in the very bodies of the people who live in these places. Yeah,
it's a form of poisoning. I mean, you can look at industrial animal operations as one example, right? Landfills, petrochemical operations, right? Refineries, Cancer Alley in Louisiana, right? Houston Ship Channel. You can look at fracking sites when you're extracting oil and gas, right? You know, these communities that live in there, they're basically being poisoned, right? And so and a lot of this, we're allowing folks to be poisoned every day. And so we have to, you know, I talk about liberation. We have to liberate folks from environmental slavery.
Yeah.
Okay. And as you were saying before about segregation, you can look at highways and byways that disproportionately are in communities of color is another example. And how when we drive our cars to people's neighborhoods, do we understand that we're leaving combustion byproducts? And basically their bodies are absorbing those toxicants, right? A breastfeeding mother could be absorbing those toxicants and giving that toxicant back to her breastfed baby. A pregnant mother, fetus is developing innocent fetus in the body because of the process of how we detoxify contaminants, right? Or intoxify contaminants. There could be secondary byproducts of that detoxification process that are absorbed by that fetus. So we have high body burdens of toxicants in general. And we're going to talk, and a lot of it's through food, right?
Yeah.
Thinking about food, we do a lot of this in the US. We talk about, and I'm an environmental scientist, everybody. I'm an exposure scientist. I talk about exposure. I do a lot of work on air quality, right? Do work on water quality. You know, one of the biggest sources of exposure to toxicants is food. how we raise our food. Like factory, do y'all know what we're doing when we raise animal husbandry, when we raise animals in factory farms? They're basically in jail cells, in these pens, right? Many of them have waste around them all day long. If you ever drive by a chicken farm, right, and you see the big fans, right? Why do you have these big fans? Because the accumulation of gases inside the building, if they didn't blow them out, they would basically, suffocate
Mm,
from those
yep.
gases. That's what we're dealing with. So you think about how we treat the animals in our process of how we feed the animals. I'm an environmentalist. I like to recycle, but man, do y'all know that when they're raising those animals, that in a lot of cases they are recycling waste materials, other dead animals. Even like we think about food waste. There's some food waste that these animals are eating, which makes sense in some ways if they eat the food waste as part of their food machine. But there's container waste. So you may have some food waste from McDonald's that gets recycled into food waste that's going to feed these animals.
Hmm.
So this is shocking sort of recycling of waste materials. We recycle those waste materials in the actual feed for these animals. It's not just their treatment and been the jail cells, right? And been around their own waste, but then also the feed that they're exposed to. In this case of chickens, you have issues with arsenic as well. So you can have arsenic exposure in the chicken paws, the chicken litter. I've already talked about with the hog farms, you have air quality, ammonia, hydrosulfide, organic compounds, particulate matter, right? You have big issues with, let me go back to the hog farms for a second, with feces, right? So one of my colleagues, Dr. Chris Haney, we actually grew up together in the EJ movement. We're both trained under Dr. Steve Wing to do this work. He's at Hopkins now. But Chris has done a lot of work on using tracers to track the DNA of E. coli found in the gut of hogs. So basically, they have done wipe samples inside homes and found feces of hogs inside people's homes by looking at DNA in those samples. So on the couch that you sit on the floor that your kids are playing on top of the refrigerator. Well, what about Dr. Wilson in my bedroom? Back in your bedroom, in your bathroom, because you could be tracking the waste there too, but also this intrusion be wind blown into your home.
Yeah.
So that's a form of trespass. That's a form of, it's already a nuisance issue because all the 100 different odoriferous compounds, VOCs, that are found in the plume that moves away from these factory farms, right, to people's homes. So this is what people experiencing every day. If that's not environmental slavery, you and your community is dehumanized. Part of the thing about the environmental justice movement, and I share how many of the listeners and the viewers know about the environmental justice movement. I like to say that Dr. King was the grandfather of the environmental justice movement. We call Dr. Bullis known as the father. I like to go Dr. King as the grandfather. And so y'all know, if you know your history of Dr. King's assassination, right? He was in Memphis working with the sanitation workers.
Yeah.
Who are doing what? Being treated less than human. They have waste on their bodies all day long, folks. So environmental justice is talk about dehumanization. And if you go back in history, look at that movement, sanitation worker strike. Black men were carrying around signs that I am a man. Let me slow down here. Recognize my humanity. If we recognize the humanity of people who are dealing with these issues, we wouldn't be dumping on them. If we recognize the sacredness of our animals, right, we wouldn't be treating them the way we treat them in this animal husbandry practices and having these factory farms. There's less connections in how we treat people less than we should, treat them, dehumanize them, and how we treat animals with the lack of respect and how these animals are raised in these farms.
You've talked about how people get stuck in these communities because if your water is poisoned, if your home is having feces blown into it all the time, you're obviously not going to have much value in your home if you own your own home. And one of the other things you pointed out, I think it was in the article on how this operates globally, is that many times people who are the victims of this pollution where they live, they're also forced to work in the very same industry that's polluting them. And, mentioning the sanitation workers speaks to that, is that people are literally enslaved in this system as workers, and, in a system that's completely destroying their health, destroying the value of their communities, causing their kids to have to leave. Like, you don't put down roots if you can avoid it in a community that's getting poisoned. So it's a brain drain. It separates families.
Exactly.
It's just, yeah, I don't think that environmental slavery is too strong a word.
I mean, think about the adding insult to injury. You're working a facility, maybe it's a chicken processing plant, where you have to process so many chickens per minute, right? You can't take a break. Man, where's OSHA at, y'all? And then you got a situation where you're so tight upon your next worker that when COVID comes through, everybody's gonna get COVID because you don't have enough room. You have great H, you got blood splatter, body parts all over the place. So how are you supposed to have a safe working environment in that situation? Or your agriculture worker who's working at these operations, been exposed to maybe doing some work inside the facility, been exposed to some of these air pollutants, or you could be an agriculture worker working in a agriculture field where there's pesticide application, and maybe you don't have the proper protective gear on, maybe you do, but then you take it home to your kids, you track it into your house, so then you have pesticides all over the place, and this is a big issue for our immigrant workers when it comes to working in fields where there's pesticide use, right?
Yeah,
So
and in the factories, breaking down the animal parts and processing meat, it's almost all immigrants at this point. So yes, it's moved up through the food system from the farm workers now into the processing plants, service workers. Like our food system is almost completely dominated by immigrants, and I guess that's because they have the least power in society to advocate for safe working conditions, decent wages, and to not be poisoned at work. Yeah.
Yeah, and so like you're saying with many of our immigrant populations, if you think about our Central American immigrants into the work, I mean, in Delaware, one of the issues is they're trying to, I think they're trying to build a new processing plant. And one of the communities is unincorporated, and just for the listeners and viewers, in the U.S. context, you have not everywhere that's unincorporated. You have some wealthier communities that are unincorporated. They don't want to be. They want to be kind of separate from other folks. But usually, when you have a poor community that's unincorporated, that means you don't have a town mayor, you don't have a town council. So I call it contamination without representation. Okay, so you get dumped on, right? And so, or you may, so you're an easy target for these locally wanted land uses, right? And so in Delaware, there's a community of Haitian immigrants that have been working in these facilities, right? And again, you have a language issue. So you have cultural barriers that create challenges. You have language barriers that create challenges, and people are trying to make ends meet and send money back home. So they're going to be less apt to raise their voices. And also you have anti-union movements in the factory farm space, whether it be at the farm itself or in the processing plants, right? And you also have some folks maybe undocumented, so they may be also less apt to voice their issues. So that's a huge. So those are huge barriers for folks who work in these facilities to actually be treated as humans, for the humanity to be valued, for them to not to be decommodified or commodified, right? It's actually both, because they're seen as they're providing a service, right? It's a service essential to getting this cheap food. At the same time, they're decommodified because they're not valued enough to get a break. They're not valued enough to be treated well. They're not valued enough to get their health insurance covered. They're not valued enough if something happens to make sure they get able to come back to the job. People are, losing limbs. Yeah, musculoskeletal injuries, right? Folks have been exposed, but then they get dismissed, they get invisibilized, they get erased, they get otherized. Okay, that's when we treat people like that, again, on the job, as we're talking about, that is a form of servitude. That's dehumanization. That's a form of slavery. Okay. Go ahead. Back to you, Alexis.
Well, I had a question burning that is, I don't know if it's your area of expertise, but I know you know a lot about agriculture in Maryland and how reforms have been proposed, not always implemented perfectly. I was wondering if you have an opinion on whether organic has made a difference in Maryland, if you have any observations or information about that?
No, I don't have any data on it. I do think in general, more investments in organic would be a good thing. And as I said before, for me, organic foods are helpful in a number of ways. If you have foods that have been grown, particularly when they're not using any type of asides, herbicides, pesticides, right, insecticides, all those asides, right? It is very important for human health. I mean, again, as exposure scientists, we talk a lot about air quality and water quality. We don't do enough as relates to food. It's shocking. Just in my own dealing with my own health issues recently. I was diagnosed with diabetes
Mm.
in March, and I've actually lost a lot of weight since then because I don't want to die.
Oh, good for you.
Yeah, so lost about. I saw before and after the photo. It was really interesting. I'm just like, wow, I lost about close to 50 pounds since March.
Whoa! Oh my.
Yeah. So, and what's important is I've been eating healthier, and just the food I was eating before, particularly the processed foods. There was so much wheat this, sugar that, just hidden. I'm lactose intolerant. There's milk and stuff that milk shouldn't be in.
Mm-hmm.
So just from food as exposure pathway, right? Eating whole foods, eating organic foods, so much better for you. What excites me I love talking about food. So I'm glad. The reason why I wanted to meet with you, talk to you, because I love talking about food. I have a micro farm at my house, personally. Just let people know. I live in Bowie. I think everybody should grow their own food. I think food, let me say this, y'all. Food is power. Food is health. Food is culture. Okay? Food is wealth.
Mm-hmm.
We all should be growing our own food. We all, if we can, should be growing organic food. Now, I don't use a lot of pesticides. I don't know any pesticides, right? So, hey, the bugs come, you get yours, I'll get mine. Hey, squirrel, you get your half tomato, I take the rest. so I don't use stuff. So I end up losing stuff. But if it's holy, it must be from God. So I eat what I grow. It's a different experience. When you grow food, if it lose a little bit to the caterpillars or whatever, you grew it. You have a different connection to it. I don't want to waste that food.
Yeah.
But at my home, I'm growing muscadines. I have a grape arbor. I have a blackberry trellis. I'm growing 130 pots of things on my deck. Muscadine vine on my deck. I have 16 to 18 raised beds in the back, mostly 4x4s, couple 2x9s.
You're serious? Wow.
So I think growing food and growing it organically food sovereignty is important to me. Food sovereignty is a way for health. We should have food co-ops, organic food co-ops, where we're not using the asides, right? So it's good for nature and it's good for human health. I think, and from a climate change perspective, right? I think it's also beneficial because be a smaller carbon footprint, whether it be more or organic sort of farms in rural communities, or more suburban or urban agriculture, also permaculture. I mean, I'm interested in us having green roofs and green walls and folks growing food on the builtscape, transforming again, Alexa, all these highways and byways and communities that have been dealing with the National Health Defense Act and segregation, and transforming them into greenways, having food forests. There's so much we can do around food we should turn our cities into food utopias, eco-utopias, by growing food. It would be transformative. And so I'm not answering your question specifically, but I think organic food is a part of that. It's really a part of that.
Yeah, I mean, that wasn't where I was going because I didn't realize you were so into this. I'm very impressed. You're more of an expert than I thought. I was actually asking a question that was going to have more of maybe not as much of a positive answer, because one of the problems we have in organic right now, because of the enforcement, a lot of farmers are going into organic, independent, family scale farmers they're transitioning their operations into organic because it's an opportunity to actually get paid what it costs farmers to produce the food. They can't get paid what it costs them to produce the food in the industrial system. So organic held out this promise. And a lot of farmers made these investments. And then what's happened since then is first it was, the small family farmer who did it because they knew it was the right thing to do and they thought it would help them stay on the land and continue to farm. But then after those people made it cool, then of course the corporations came in and the corporations consolidated farms and made bigger operations. And what's happening now with chicken particularly, and that's the big industry in Maryland. I honestly, I don't know what's happening in Maryland with organic, but I know what's happening across the country with chicken is that the biggest producers are feeding the chickens organic feed, but they're basically not doing anything else that's different. They have the chicken in huge houses. They're not following the rules that say that organic animals have to have access to the outdoors. There's no particular pasture requirement for chickens like there is for ruminant animals in organic. So we have this access to the outdoors. The animals are supposed to be able to exhibit their natural behaviors. When I read this, I'm like, oh, well, I know what that means. And I picture a beautiful farm where chickens are outdoors and roosting in trees and eating grass and bugs because that's the natural behavior of chicken. But what this has come to mean in industrial organic is that they just barely meet the minimum requirements. And the U.S. Department of Agriculture does not seem interested at all in enforcing the rules against the biggest producers. So I'm kind of worried because I feel like, there is good demand for organic. And I'm sure there are a bunch of the major corporations that do a lot of their operations here in Maryland that would like to access that. But I wouldn't, if I was telling a community, if there was a big organic producer that wanted to, or probably it would be one of the big conventional producers that wanted to open organic chicken houses, I wouldn't, with a good conscience, be able to say to a community oh yeah, that's going to be way better for you, because it might be better for the community where the corn or the soy is grown, because they're not going to be exposed to as many pesticides. But as far as I can tell, what's happening in organic right now is there are a lot of industrial producers, and probably the issues would be sort of the same. And I don't know if you have, I guess.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a very different question than the way I went, but I was excited about talking about food. But no,
I think fun, and we can go back to that too.
really interesting question, and I think you're exactly right. It's a way to kind of present themselves as being organic because they see it as part of the current trend that consumers want to consume organics. People are becoming more conscious about where the food is coming from. They're becoming more conscious about climate change and things like that. So it's even, I think in some ways, an exploitation of environmental sustainability goals, ESG. So it's really I don't know if it's the right way to say it, but not the right interpretation of the spirit of ESG. Right. So they're saying they're doing these environmental sustainability goals that integrate into supply chain, right? And having, I'm going to use the language of the Inflation Reduction Act for those y'all can look that up. This climate smart agriculture is another kind of euphemism that's out there right now. I was like, okay, all these nonsense euphemisms out there. I don't believe that their approach to organic agriculture, at least the chicken, is reflective of the spirit of the organic food movement and will not benefit the communities that are disproportionately impacted by industrial factory farms.
Yeah, unfortunately. Yeah. In some ways, I still want it to have, because I'd still rather have all those factory farms be organic factory farms. but it's not a huge difference. Yeah.
It's a step forward. So, I mean, in some ways, if I'm thinking about, we talk about this transition to a true organic, or transition from certain types of fossil fuels is a different example, to clean energy. We talk about natural gas, which again is a euphemism, to clean. This is the same kind of transitioning that you see. But I'd rather that be regenerative agriculture, sustainable agriculture, family farm driven instead of
Yeah,
vertically integrated corporate. The
exactly.
corporate takeover is part of the problem. The corporate takeover will not allow us to really meet the full principles behind organic food, or even be responsive to the principles of environmental justice. Because to me, you need to have an equity framework when we think about intensive agriculture. So equity means who's producing, what they're making. Are folks better, make a living wage? Think about what a lot of these chicken farmers, they sign a dotted line. They have to keep signing a dotted line because they basically are in the red the whole time. So they have to keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger farms and producing more and more animals just so they can make ends meet. That in itself is, again, I'm from Mississippi. Y'all know about sharecropping. That's a form of sharecropping. So you
Yeah,
have an environmental slavery
yep,
embedded into that system too.
absolutely.
So the corporate integrators get away with all the money. But again, you talk about externalities and externalities of the food production. It's on the farmers, those individual farmers. So the system is broken. So you have exploitation of environmental slavery, everybody. You have exploitation of workers. You have exploitations of farmers. You have exploitation of host communities. And then you have entities like the USDA who are complicit in what's happening. The Farm Bill is a driver of these poor policies. The Inflation Reduction Act, climate smart agriculture. I was like, huh? No, none of that's smart agriculture. It's going to lead to more entrenchment of bad farming practices, more entrenchment of these corporate integrators. They're talking about now capturing. This is a side point, but relevant. Methane from these operations for energy.
Hmm.
That's not sustainable agriculture. That's going
Oh
to
no.
again impact the local communities, impact the local residents, right? And when you do biogas or a digester process, right, you create pollution, and you still have a waste product that has to be dealt with. So what are they going to do with that waste product? Are they going to feed it to the animals? Mm-hmm. Or are they going to apply it to the land? You still going to have some type of negative environmental impact. Okay. So I think we have to have some true, as you said, stepping up from USDA, also some stepping up from the EPA. Again, I think in the food space, three agencies that have literally dropped the ball or kicked the ball, whichever one you look at: USDA, EPA, and FDA. All three of them have done a poor job when it comes to our food system, and they have been complicit in the broken food system we have in this country, and the exploitation of various populations that have been marginalized and invisibilized, and the exploitation of family farmers, and just the whole system is a system that's based on greed, that's based on cheap food, making labor cheap, and again, those entities and individuals and communities internalizing all the externalities. So the corporations get all the benefits, but the people get none of them.
Yeah. Yeah. I've had a couple of conversations this week for World Food Day that I think are relevant to all the issues that you're raising here. Moms Across America, run by Zen Honeycutt, she's been doing great work around glyphosate, around Monsanto's Roundup herbicide, now Bayer's Roundup herbicide.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, mostly we treat this like as an individual problem. Like, okay, so if you don't want to be exposed, you need to go organic. You need to start buying organic food. But we're sort of discounting how a lot of food is institutional food. And it's the people who are most vulnerable who are eating the most institutional food and have less control. Like going back to your concept of environmental slavery, it's like when you don't have a choice what you're going to eat. Anybody in a nursing home or a hospital doesn't really have a choice what they're going to eat. And these institutions are huge buyers and they have huge influence, but they're not doing the right thing. So Moms Across America recently did tests on the food that school kids are eating. And she tested it for glyphosate, but also for lots of other pesticides. And it's, some of the things were actually surprising because you wonder like how so much glyphosate got into certain foods. Like the one that had the most glyphosate was the tacos. So we've got like, okay, so a corn or wheat tortilla,
Yes.
and probably sprayed with, like, the wheat is sprayed with the glyphosate to dry it. The corn was genetically engineered to absorb glyphosate, but that's mostly like ground beef, and so the animal ate the glyphosate sprayed feed, but you're the one who ends up eating it ultimately. So
Exactly. It's the food chain. It's like going back to what biology class or ecology class, right? You know, we're the apex at the top. So bioaccumulation, biomagnification. So you have animals that we have basically contaminated feed. So you add the pesticides, right? Plus the food waste recycling I talked about before. That's going to
mhm,
the feed. And then
mhm.
we eat those animals. So part of this is a different point that I'm going to make about it's organic, and I want to take away the organic point. But part of the plant-based part, we should raise our plants organically and eat the plants, right? So I'm not fully advocating you have to be plant-based or vegan, but you get the minerals, the proteins that the animals have in their bodies. They get that from the feed that they eat. So why not get rid of the middle animal and eat the plants? Okay, that's a little side point, but I just want to let people know, like, wouldn't it be better to eat the plants and not eat the animals that are basically eating contamination? They're eating
Well,
poison.
yeah, I mean, I was a vegetarian for 30 years based on, I read Diet for a Small Planet, and I heard that the rainforests are being cut down for cattle grazing. And it was just very clear to me that being a vegetarian was the way. And, since I've been doing this work in regenerative organic agriculture, I've learned about, how things can be done totally differently. So apparently cows aren't even, naturally predisposed to eat grains, period. And ruminant animals, they can eat so many things that we can't eat. We can't go out and eat the lawn, but they can. And
Yeah,
certainly, like, they can. I was just learning from my coworker and producer, Corey Melby, who's backstage here. He was just telling me how branches of trees and leaves are a forage for animals that are ruminants. They can process all of these cellulose plants that we can't process. Our stomachs can't digest them. So for people around the world, livestock has always been a necessity. It's like, if you don't have a refrigerator or a lot of, great big
yeah,
pantry or a store to go to every day, like, your storage is in your animals.
yeah.
They eat what you can't eat. They're actually, I also talked to some grass-fed beef farmers earlier this week for World Food Day, and they were making the case that cows are they're producing the original plant-based meat. Because of course, what the corporations want to call plant-based these days is like genetically modified bacteria producing synthetic proteins, and they want to say
It's
that's
the science
plant.
fiction, becoming science fiction fantasy becoming a fact, right? Science fact now. Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, well, that was basically all. I do want to get back to your areas of expertise and the things that you've written. So you wrote this whole article about environmental slavery, and I guess it was initiated by these realizations that, dang, the people who were, like, in these communities that historically were enslaved, if they didn't leave that area, then now they're being victimized by environmental racism. The pollution, the factory farms are being
Mhm.
sited right where their ancestors were enslaved. So it's
Yes.
kind of, in that context, it's very clear and direct. And that inspired you to write about environmental slavery. But then you took the whole concept global and wrote another article, very well researched with tons of citations, about how this operates globally. And the two examples that you gave that I recall, one was about a farmer in Thailand who said when she grew up, the area around where she lived was so beautiful. It was surrounded by forests, and her family, they had their own farm and produced delicious food, and they had a nice, by global standards of capitalism, they're just poor subsistence farmers and
Mhm.
they need real jobs. And so, why don't we cite all of our recycling facilities? You describe in this article about how even China now is exporting their waste. They've become a rich country. They can do this now. There are poor countries that they can have influence over. And China is one of the countries citing plastic recycling in Thailand. And this Thai farmer was like, this is your waste. Why am I dealing with your waste? Why have you poisoned my community so that I can't do what we did for generations here?
Mhm.
And now, now everybody also, you get poisoned by the industry and you're forced to work in it because it's destroyed your
All the
historical
jobs,
life.
the normal jobs that you had are all gone. So that's the only place of employment. So yeah, you see parallels in the U.S. context, right? If you think about waste streams, right? A lot of the landfills in the South, the waste is not coming from the South. It's the waste is coming from towns in the Northeast, right?
Mhm.
So you have that. So you see our low middle income countries at LMICs, right? You have waste coming from more developed countries like the US, like China, parts of the UK, right? And that waste is then, particularly like e-waste and other forms of waste, that waste is then shipped to these low middle income countries that may not have the same regulatory standards that we have in the US, right? Or even this is the thing about think about asbestos and some of our pesticides. Oh yeah, we're fine. We're regulated. We can't use that more in the U.S., but we can use it in this country. So we then export those products to other countries too. And so we poison folks through products that have been deemed not legal to use in the U.S., but that same corporation can then go use it in another country, and then we ship our e-waste to these other countries, right? Where folks are forced, to recycle e-waste, and you see some of the highest rates of cancer, reproductive effects, developmental effects in these communities because they're basically been exposed to poison every day.
Mm.
And so it's shocking, again, getting back to my point of the human rights element of this, right? How we dehumanize so many people around the world who don't have power, who don't have voice. You see this a lot with indigenous peoples who like the land tenureship. Hundreds of years of owning the land, passed down generation. And all of a sudden, their government sells off a piece of their land to a corporation and they build a new factory. Or they cut down all the trees and they do cattle farming, right? And so that is a huge part of the global environmental justice movement. Land tenureship, mining issues that you see, mining waste that you see in countries, if you go to parts of Africa, right? And then again, this exporting is actually not just exporting, it's even the commodification. So it's a waste so this is a hazardous material in my country, but then we export it and make money from it when we send it to another country. We do the same thing in the U.S. I have an example. One of my community mentors, Naima Muhammad, helped to found the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network, right? She tells a story of how, they have this hog waste in counties in North Carolina, like Duplin County, which is the country's largest producer of hogs in the U.S., right? And then, in the lagoon, if it spills, it's a hazardous waste. When the lagoon, if it spills, in the lagoon, it's a commodity, right? They truck the waste, they spray it on spray fields a commodity. But when they would go protest, in the state capitol in North Carolina, and they take the waste and put it on the ground, they were arrested because they were putting the hazardous waste on the ground. So in that community, it's a commodity. It's not a hazardous waste. But when you take it to the state capitol grounds, it's a hazardous waste. That's the problem, y'all.
Mm-hmm.
That is hazardous, regardless of where it is. But since these folks are Black, they're poor, they're immigrant, they don't have power. The waste is deemed to be more valuable than they are. The waste is deemed to be, it's a commodity when they're treated less than human. That's a shocking thing that communities are experiencing every day. That waste is a commodity, but their right to breathe clean air, drink safe water, to enjoy the quality of life in the house, right? those rights are null and void. So, you know, in the Right to Harm documentary, if y'all want to look at that documentary, it's a very important documentary about factory farming. You know, one of the speakers talks about inalienable rights, right? You should have an inalienable right to clean air, clean water, safe food, safe housing. And many folks in our country looks like they don't.
Yeah. Wow, Dr. Wilson, you've really opened my eyes. I mean, I felt like, you know, I've been an environmentalist and activist my whole life, but yeah, what you wrote really opened my eyes, because when you think about it, like, you know, I wouldn't say, oh yeah, take the waste and trash from my industrialized life and go inject it into this baby in a poor community in my country or another country. Like, I wouldn't say like, oh sure, yeah, that's a good idea. But that's essentially what's happening.
Every
And
day.
you laid that out so compelling, in such a compelling way, through your environmental slavery articles. So I really hope that people will check out your Medium page at ceejh.medium.com. A lot of great articles there, although I don't see anything super recent. Are you guys blogging on your website now rather than Medium?
Well, we have a few things. I'm just so busy, but we do have. I have some older things too at the conversation if folks are interested. Where we talked
Oh, yeah.
about industrial animal operations and need to make sure that we have all these regulations right. And this is also gets to the procedural inequities right. We have the Clean Air Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, Clean Water Act, but let me be specific: the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act. Let me say Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, and EPCRA, the Emergency Planning Community Right to Know Act. Those laws should apply to industrial animal operations in the same way they apply to POTWs. POTWs is publicly operated treatment works, sewage and water treatment plants. We have so much sewage of human sewage that we actually treat and we manage, but we have millions of pounds, billions of tons of animal waste that we don't do the same thing to.
Right.
So those are also things that y'all can look to. And hopefully with this new Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights and this new EPA administrator, maybe you'll see some action where these right to farm laws and all these exemptions that, I mean, you got all this waste, producing more waste than, you know, people do in some communities, right? But we don't do anything. We just put them in a pit. And some of my community partners will call that a it pit. I'm not gonna say with the first letters, SH. I'm trying to be professional here, right? But it's like a lagoon that, think about it, y'all, for hog farms. Those of you who are a little bit older, like, you know, my age or older, remember the Blue Lagoon? We call hog lagoons, again, it's a euphemism, lagoon. Is that a lagoon you want to swim in? No. It's a cesspool. It's a toilet that does not flush, but it does leak, okay? So it's shocking again. Y'all should read up about these issues. And then we as consumers got to do more to push for change. We are in this together. So how can you do more to help those communities who are dealing with factory farms? You can do it with what you buy. You can do it with how you vote. So you got buying power. I'm from Mississippi, so my country came out. You got buying power and you got voting power. Okay. That would be really helpful to be in solidarity with folks who've been disproportionately impacted by factory farms.
Yeah, and people can get directly involved with the Socially Responsible Agriculture Project. They're spread out around the country. Like, even if you live, I mean, I didn't realize how close we were here in DC to the factory farms on the eastern shore of Maryland, and how different the air is there until I went with SRAP to go visit factory farms. And so basically, anywhere in the country, you're within a short drive of these factory farms, and there are community leaders who probably didn't choose, you know, if they had said what they wanted to be when they grew up, they probably wouldn't have said like fighting factory farms, but they had to do it because that's where they lived, that's where they ended up raising a family, and they, you know, once you're there, you can't leave very easily. So we can be in solidarity directly with these communities by joining up with SRAP.
Yeah, please watch the Right to Harm documentary, SRAP, also Food and Water Watch.
Yeah.
Find out about any local environmental justice groups. If you're in North Carolina, the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network is working on industrial animal operations. If you're in California, the California Environmental Justice Alliance will be another group to engage with. There's, there's groups, Chapter Sierra Club in Iowa that are working on, factory farm issues. So there's groups across the country that are working on this issue. So just find out who they are and become part of the team. We need all of you.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, there's one more thing that you've been working on. I Googled you, I did a Google News search, and I haven't touched on most of what you're up
Yeah,
to.
I do a lot of stuff.
You're in like
Yeah.
3 news articles this week about different projects that you're working on. But one of the things that I thought was interesting was a piece of legislation that would require NEPA, the National Environmental Protection Act.
Policy Act.
And Policy Act. Okay.
Yep.
NEPA to recognize environmental justice. And it was kind of shocking when I read that. I was like, they don't have to do, like, I mean, we outlawed racism a long time ago in this country. We've got a lot of laws that protect civil rights. I am just shocked that that is not already one of the things you have to consider.
Well, it's interesting, the thing about we fought for civil rights. You think about Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, 64, 1968, right? But it's the implementation.
Right.
I always joke. I'm trying to be funny here, but you gotta. It's a laugh, not the laugh. Because it's so much pain. It's just hard to talk about these issues, right? Without taking in so much of an emotional toll that people go through, and as advocates and activists.
Mm-hmm.
But we wouldn't have environmental injustice if we actually applied the law equally to everybody.
Yeah.
So if the fact that we actually had enforced Title VI, if every federal agency, because many of them have been egregious, including the USDA, as it relates to Title VI.
Oh yeah.
Black farmers lawsuit,
Mm-hmm.
there's all kinds of examples, right? We wouldn't have environmental justice. So Title VI is part of the Civil Rights Act. The Title VI talks about disparate impacts. You got to make sure you're protecting certain groups, and certain of those groups are groups based on race and ethnicity, right? And so NEPA, when we look at NEPA hasn't really done a lot to protect public health. NEPA hasn't really done a lot to protect those who experience environmental injustice. But now with the EPA saying that they're going to really start enforcing Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, hopefully that would add more teeth to NEPA. But it would be great to see other federal agencies. And President Biden did have 2 executive orders on racial equity. And I know that USDA has a equity commission to say, hey, USDA, look at your history, look at your programs initiatives, who you disproportionately impacted, and then start finally protecting those groups that you haven't protected as you should have been protected under Title VI, whether it be Black farmers, whether it be our brothers and sisters, Latinx, Latino, Hispanic brothers and sisters, immigrant brothers and sisters picking our food, many of them picking our food, and also other immigrants from other countries who are in the agriculture industry. You haven't done the job to protect them. Hopefully with this new, focus on racial equity and the focus on Title VI, that we'll see some progress for these groups that have been, again, as I said before, invisibilized and otherwise and forgotten by our federal agencies.
Yeah. Wow. Well, Dr. Wilson, this has been very educational, very uplifting still. I'm really glad to hear everything that you do for yourself, for your own health, for your family and your community by growing food. It's really impressive. It's been such a joy to talk to you today.
Thanks for having me, Alexis. Hopefully it was useful. And yes, definitely love, I think, food, growing food, raising food. Everybody should get into regenerative agriculture, sustainable agriculture, permaculture. Just get into the food movement, whether it be if you're vegan or if you're vegetarian or if you're omnivore, wherever you are. We all should know about our food, and we should all do more to grow our own food. That's power, health, wealth, and culture. That's freedom. That's sovereignty. So I'll stop talking. Thank you, Alexis.
Oh, that's beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Wilson. Thanks for everybody who's watching, and hopefully we'll have a chance to talk to you again very soon. Take care.
Thank you.